We are in Mark chapter 8. This is the halfway point. When we finish this, we'll be halfway through the book of Mark already, which does not seem real. But tonight the title is A Spiritual Checkup. A spiritual health checkup. So let's start in chapter 8, verse 1. At that time, after a very large crowd again had gathered together with nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and told them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they've already been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. Think about that. Most of us don't want to miss a meal. These people were there for 3 days straight without a meal, just so that they could hear Jesus. If I send them away to their homes hungry, they'll faint on the road. Some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered him, Where could anyone get enough bread to feed these people out here in the wilderness? Oh, by the way, there should be an emphasis on these people. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but there should be an emphasis there. He asked them, How many loaves of bread do you have? 7, they said. So he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and he gave thanks. He broke them into pieces and kept giving them to his disciples to distribute. So they served them to the crowd. They also had a few small fish. He blessed them and he said that the fish should also be distributed. The people ate until they were filled, or the same wording with the feeding of the 5,000, till they were glutted. They couldn't eat anymore. Then the disciples picked up the leftover pieces, 7 large baskets full. Now about 4,000 men were there. Then he sent them on their way. Immediately he got into a boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmutha. Now this from Matthew's account in chapter 15 says it was on the border of Magdala, which Mary Magdalene, that was where she was raised. And so it's on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Right now they are on the northwest side. So anyways, this passage is not to be confused with the feeding of the 5,000. They're not different tellings of the same story. These are actually 2 separate occasions. Chapter 6, there was the feeding of the 5,000. Chapter 8, there's the feeding of the 4,000. And when you compare them, you actually find there's a whole lot more in contrast than what there is in comparison. With the first one, in the feeding of the 5,000, the people had stayed with Jesus a day. And here they had stayed with Jesus for 3 days. In the first account, they sat on the green grass. Remember that alluded back to Psalms 23. It also meant that there was springtime then. Here, Mark just says that they sat down on the ground. By summer or late summer, most of the grass in the wilderness is now since dried up and they're dead. In the first one, they were on the east side of the lake, where they were near their hometown of Capernaum, and that was all Jewish community. Here, they're on the northwest side of the lake in Decapolis, the 10 Gentile cities that are there. In the first one, he used 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here, he used 7 loaves and a few fish. We don't know the number of the fish. In the first one, they had 12 baskets of leftovers. And the baskets that are mentioned, the wording that's used in the Greek is like a handbag. And this is also something that's unique. The wording that he used is a small bag that you would take with you, but it was shaped different than this other one. This one, the shape, it would come up and it would go in and then have a lip. And it's very distinctly Jewish. Because as they were so worried about being ceremonially unclean, like we talked about last week with the washing of hands. If you bought something in the marketplace, you didn't even want the Gentiles' dust on your food or whatever you were buying. So they would have large jars, but the entrance in those jars were very small. The Gentiles didn't care about being ceremonial unclean. And so the Gentile baskets and bags that you see, or jars, They had a really wide mouth brim, and they were like a bowl, like we would think of today. What Mark mentioned in chapter 6 for the feeding of the 5,000 were these small, carry-around little ones with a little opening. Very Jewish. In this one, though, he says there are 7 baskets left over, and the baskets he's talking about are commercial-sized baskets. They would be for large amounts of grain. It would be enough to carry a person. And if you remember, I believe it was Acts chapter 9, and Paul has to be led over the city wall, and he was lowered down in a basket. It's the same basket here. So you think about this. The baskets are large enough to hold Paul being lowered down the wall, and there were 7 baskets that were left over. So all of these 2 stories are very different. The one was to the Jewish people. The other one was to the Gentile people. Now you'd say, Pastor, why does that even matter? Well, the reason it matters is consistency in the Bible. What we're seeing here is a biblical principle that's being fulfilled out in Jesus' ministry. Paul talked about it in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. He said, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and then also for the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith." The biblical principle here is the gospel was given to the Jews first. That's where Jesus came first. And then he spread to the Gentiles. The first miracle of the feeding was to the Jews. The second one was to the Gentiles here in Decapolis. It shows all across the Bible this pattern, that it was for the Jew first and then to the Gentile. Jesus did this so that his disciples would see that the message of the gospel is not just for the Jews. It's from this point on. As they leave here, they're going to go to one other place we'll talk about tonight, and then they're headed to Jerusalem, and Jesus is going to die. Jesus, before he goes, wants them to get the idea that yes, the gospel does come to the Jews, but it's also, I have compassion for the Gentiles as well. Because they were raised completely different. They were raised to hate those tramp dogs like we talked about last week. But Jesus has compassion on them. Also, you can notice, do you really think Jesus needed the disciples to pass out the food? Do you think that he needed them to separate it? Or that he could have just prayed and manna would have fallen from heaven, right? That's what he did in the Old Testament. But it goes to the same consistency. All of the disciples were Jewish. And the receivers were Gentile. The message went to the Jews first. And then the Jews took it to the Gentiles. It's consistency. But also, not just showing that Jesus had compassion, but it's a message for you and I too. Like we just read in Romans, even in the same passage in verse 17, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. If you take it in a spiritual context, Jesus gives the bread and the fish to the disciples. Out of what they receive, they give to everyone else around them. Works the same way for you and I. What we receive in our relationship with God, he gives us so that we can bless those that are in need around us. Works the same way. What happens when we hold it back? We get fat and lazy. Notice the disciples here, they passed it all out. There was more than enough to go around, but often we want to keep our testimony to ourselves. Keep our blessing to ourselves. All the while the world around us is starving of hunger. It's not how God intended it. We are to give as we are given. There is enough of the gospel or for food God's provision for everyone to have enough even more. And that's even to those dogs, those tramps, the worst of the worst. And we need to remember that as we distribute God's good news to the world around us, that this message is more than enough for anyone else, even the worst of the worst. All right, verse 11. The Pharisees arrived, yay, and began arguing with Jesus. They tested him by demanding from him a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply in his spirit and remarked, "Why do those living today demand a sign? I tell all of you that with certainty, no sign will be given to this generation." Leaving them, he got in a boat again, and he crossed to the other side. These Pharisees, we just dealt with them in the last chapter. They have traveled now into Gentile territory. Now it's still Israel, but it's also Gentile territory. It's predominantly Gentiles here. They are going to the very outskirts of Israel as a nation. And they are traveling 90 miles from Jerusalem all the way up here just to argue with Jesus. And to be honest, if they really cared about seeing the signs, all they had to do was stick around a little while. All they had to do was ask some of the people that had been healed. Ask some in those cities that Jesus couldn't go in, hey, how did you get healing? They're in the Gentile areas where they were laying people out in the streets and they were just coming by and reaching up and grabbing Jesus. That was it. All they had to do was ask. But the problem wasn't that they weren't seeing the signs. It's that they didn't want to see the signs. They were seeing the truth and rejecting it. The way this text is written, it says that he sighed deeply in his spirit. It literally gives the idea that Jesus was angry with them. You know, we need to be really careful about what we reject as God's truth. I've heard it, I don't know how many times, and man, I heard it from a guy, if I mentioned his name, everyone in the room would know about him. He's one of the biggest pastors in the entire United States. And I heard him on a Bible or on a sermon, it was either this week or last week, and he said something that was blatantly false. And I'm riding in the car, and I hear him say it, and I thought, well, that's not true. Because there's this example, this example, this example, and I had 4 in my mind in a matter of a minute and a half of where God had done exactly the opposite. And his phrase was, God doesn't do this. We need to be real careful what we say God can and can't do. Because the minute we try to put God in a box, we find out he doesn't fit. He doesn't fit inside our feeble mind understanding. And about the time our feeble minds do understand what he's doing and how big he is and how great he is, he's usually off somewhere else doing something else because he couldn't do it with us because we didn't believe. There's a whole lot of people that say God doesn't show up anymore. Well, he may not do it in the United States because of our lack of belief, but out in the Middle East, he's showing up inside of rooms and taking terrorists and bringing them to their knees like he did Paul. We can't put God in a box. He's God. We need to be very careful what we reject. Because in rejecting what God can do, there's a lot of things that he won't be able to do with us. Verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to take any bread along. They left in a hurry. You know, Jesus got mad at the Pharisees. They got in the boat and they left. And while they did, they forgot the bread. But they had 1 loaf with them in the boat. Jesus had been warning them, watch out. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, or the Herodians. So they were discussing with one another the fact that they didn't have any bread. Knowing this, Jesus asked them, why are you discussing the fact that you don't have any bread? Don't you understand or perceive yet? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Do you have ears but fail to hear? Do you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets did you have that were left over with pieces? They told him 12. When I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000 just a day ago, how many large baskets did you fill with the leftover pieces? They told him 7. Then he asked them, don't you understand yet? Jesus was using an illustration for the moment. He didn't care that they didn't have bread. That one piece of bread could have more than filled them all if he could take 5 and fill 4,000. Or 5,000, excuse me. He was taking an illustration and using it. He said, be careful of the leaven of the Pharisees or the Herodians. Leaven throughout the Bible in consistency talks about sin. It talks about the pride that puffs up. And he said, don't let it happen to you. The Pharisees, they were hypocrites, and he called them that. They were actors. They said one thing on the outside, but inside they were dead men's bones. They were self-righteous. They looked down at everyone else because they felt like they were better. And the leaven on the inside of them puffed them up. They were prideful. They were arrogant. The leaven of the Herodians was different, though. They were worldly. They were proud that they were living differently than the Jews. And they believed that through political maneuvering, they could get a better world. And they were proud about that. And Jesus says, don't let either one of them get in your heart. But while he's giving them this warning, they're too busy passing the buck for who forgot the bread. They're passing, well, I was doing this. You were supposed to have grabbed the bread. It sounds like my kids. Jesus said, wait a minute. You all are thinking about bread. Have you lost your minds? Have you just forgotten? I could take this one loaf and I could feed all of us more than we could ever eat. And so he starts to ask them, and he asks them several questions. And man, are they some good questions. You could tell he's kind of exasperated with them. He says, do your hearts not recognize the spiritual truth I'm trying to give you yet? Are your hearts still hardened? Do you have eyes and you're still blind? Do you have ears and yet you're still deaf? Don't you remember what I've done? But obviously they didn't. Verse 22. Boy, I'm moving along tonight, y'all. As they came to Bethsaida, some of the people brought a blind man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. Jesus took the blind man by the hand and he led him out of the village. He spit into his eyes, placed his hands on him, and asked him, do you see anything? The man looked up and he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. I can see some colors and I can see some shapes. Then Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes again and he saw clearly. His sight was completely restored. He was seeing 20/20. And he saw everything perfectly, even from a distance. Then Jesus sent him home, saying, don't go into the village or tell anyone in the village. Mark's the only one to mention this miracle in the Gospels. Now remember, they're also in Bethsaida. This is now, they've gone back into Jewish territory. Something else that's unique, this is the only person in the Bible at all that had to be touched by Jesus twice. It's interesting. And then Jesus' method. And rubs it in the guy's eyes. Twice. Maybe I've just been doing healing and praying on people at the altar wrong all this time. Who's needing healing tonight? Let me work one up. Everybody points to Greg. All right, come on up, Greg. Well, I don't know what it is about Jesus' spit. But last week, we talked about the person that couldn't speak. And what did Jesus do? He spit and put his finger on his tongue. Man spoke perfectly after that. This time, he does it to the man's eyes. Maybe Jesus' spit had all kinds of amazing healing properties. Maybe we should have been bottling it up. I don't know. But yeah. Anyways, I think the reason that it was always different was because each person had individual needs, kind of like we talked about last week. We don't really see Jesus fitting into a mold when he was healing. Each time was a little bit different, and he did it in a different way. This one, he takes the guy out of town. The only person he does that for. And then he's the only guy that he spit in his eyes. Jesus dealt with each person individually where their need was. And let's be honest. I mean, even though Jesus did it different every time, there's still people that make ritual out of healing. And if Jesus would have done all of his healings the same way, we'd have probably said, okay, well, we've got to do it this way. We've got to put it inside this box, and people won't get healed if we don't. I don't think that was Jesus' intention. I think Jesus' intention was to go to that person with their personal need and to heal them. Because, like we said earlier, he had compassion on them. Also, notice this is another occasion, like we had in chapter 2, where it was on basis of the friend's faith, not the blind man's. The friends were the one that brought this man to Jesus. And like I said back in chapter 2, this should challenge our faith. Because all too often the people out there, they don't have faith. But we do. And we need to be bringing those to Jesus. We need to be using our faith so that their faith can grow. That's why our testimonies are so important. How can they grow in their faith if we don't share our faith? That was another one. Ricky talked about that tonight in chapter 10 of Romans. Our faith is to be enriching the world around us. How many people are missing out because we're being silent? Jesus took this man outside the city. Bethsaida was one of the cities that Jesus condemned because of their unbelief. And it's just possible that Jesus took him outside that town because the surrounding neighborhood was unfavorable to Jesus' work. Not saying they didn't want to hear what he had to say, but they didn't believe that he was who he said he was. You know, sometimes we need Jesus to take us from where we're at and the friends that we have and take us outside of those things so that he can do something in us. If we want healing in an area of our life, we have to be willing to let Jesus lead us away from some friends, away from some actions, and even sometimes away from where we're living. I'm a testimony to that. I couldn't be a Christian where I was at in Michigan growing up. It took me coming all the way down here as a sophomore in high school into boarding school before I was able to get settled. Sometimes Jesus has to lead us out before he can change anything on the inside of us. Don't allow your comfortable surroundings to prevent God from healing you. That one's a sermon in and of itself, I guess. Jesus does 2 healings here. And I think part of the reason is the first one was according to their friend's faith. The blind man's friends were the ones that brought him to Jesus. And it was according to their faith that the man was healed to begin with. And then as the man began to actually see things, his faith grew. And then Jesus touched him again and healed him. It wasn't for a lack of power. And Jesus could have just said, all right, heal that man way over there. He's blind. And it happened. I mean, he could cast demons out that way. He could certainly heal this man's blindness. But Jesus is pulling this man's faith out. And he's drawing this man closer to him by growing his faith. All right. As this man's faith grew, so did his eyesight and his understanding. Verse 27. Then Jesus and his disciples set out for the villages around Caesarea Philippi. To give us a full perspective of what's about to take place, I need to take you on a mental geography journey to northeast Israel. This is about 25 miles north of Galilee. This is almost the Syrian-Lebanon border. If you take the River Jordan and you follow it all the way to the end, it comes to a wall, a mountain wall at the base of Mount Hermon. And the water, it used to, it doesn't anymore, but it used to come out of that wall in a cave. It was at the base of that cave that the pagans believed that was the door to hell, or to the gates of Hades. And you remember that passage, and we're not going to talk about it here, but it's in Matthew, where it says the gates of hell won't stand against you, against the church, when he's talking to Peter. That happens here because he's looking at that. The Greek god Pan was worshipped here. He was half male, half goat. And he played a pan flute. That's the reason his name was Pan. If you don't know what he is or how they worshipped, all you have to do is ask just about any kid in today's world, and they'll be able to tell you. Because in today's world, a good portion of them claim his name. They call themselves Pan. And probably unknowingly or unwittingly, they're worshiping him in the immoral lifestyles that they live. There was all kinds of sexual immorality, including bestiality, that took place in this spot. There were no less than 14 different shrines to different gods that were worshipped at this spot. And so Jesus takes his disciples to this place where there's such a panorama of paganism and worship of all different kinds of gods. And he asks them two important spiritual health checkup questions. He's already asked them several others, but he's going to ask them two more. So on the way up there, he was asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered him, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." Now this is a fairly easy question. All they're doing is reiterating what they've heard in the community. It's no big deal. It's not hard to repeat what somebody else has told you. The next question is going to be a lot bigger and more important. If you give the wrong answer on this one, well, it's no big deal. It's what they believe. Then Jesus began to ask them, "But who do you say that I am?" Now that's a question of a whole other ballgame. Because that one you have to have right. This is Jesus' 12 disciples. I mean, we're in a close proximity. We've been following him around for 3 years now. You got to get this one right. Peter answered and he said, "You are the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about this. Peter got it right. He said, "You are the Messiah." Direct article, there's no one else. You are the Messiah. Other passages say the Christ, but it literally means the same thing. The Christ was the Greek for Messiah, and Messiah is the Jewish form. Folks, we have to get this answer right. This is the most important. I mean, eventually, one of these days, you're going to stand before him, and he's going to ask you this same question, and you better know the right answer. If you don't, you're in major trouble. It's irreversible by that point. The whole world around us is sick with a cancer of the mind that says Jesus is a Messiah. He's one out of many. Peter was the only one that got this one right, that Jesus is the Messiah. From this point on, Jesus is taking his disciples and they're going on their way to Jerusalem. And the reason he tells them not to say anything is because they had the idea that Jesus was going to come and he was going to overthrow Rome, be the ruling king, take over. And if they started passing the word around that, hey, this is Jesus, this is the guy that's going to take over the place, he's the Messiah, then they'd have had a revolt on their hands, and Jesus couldn't have accomplished his task about being the suffering servant. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Matthew's account, it's either 15, I think it's 15, it may be 16. He praises Peter, and he says, "Good job, son of Jonah. You didn't have this. God gave this to you, It's a great passage. But Mark, when he writes it, doesn't write that. He doesn't put that passage in. Because again, Mark is writing for Peter, and Peter, out of humility, he doesn't say anything about it. When, man, this was probably one of Peter's best opportunities to praise himself, to look good. This was it. I mean, he had the right answer. Nobody else did. But he keeps it quiet. That's pretty interesting. Verse 31. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man would have to suffer a great deal and be rejected by the elders, the high priests, and the scribes. Then he would be killed. But after 3 days he would rise again. He was speaking about this matter quite openly. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're not thinking God's thoughts, but humans' thoughts." Poor Peter, he's doing so great. He's got the right answer. And then he fails so miserably. He has the perfect answer of who Jesus is, but in the same thing, his preconceived notions made it so he didn't see God's plan. He had a plan in mind. He had a thought in mind about what Jesus was supposed to do. And because that was the idea, what Jesus is saying couldn't be true. Peter had the right motive in his heart. He wanted Jesus to be the leader. He wanted Jesus to take over. His heart was in the right place, but he wasn't. Peter unknowingly was giving the same temptation that Satan gave Jesus in the wilderness after being baptized. "Oh, Jesus, you don't have to die. We can do this without you suffering pain. We can take the easy way out. All you have to do is bend the knee. Whether it's bend the knee to Satan's ideas or bend the knee to my ideas, Jesus. We don't have to do it the hard way." But Jesus had to die. This was part of a deal that was made from the foundation of the world. If Jesus didn't die, there'd be no salvation for any mankind. It's what we've been talking about for the last 2 Sundays. His broken body and his spilled blood, his poured out blood. If Jesus hadn't died, he'd have broken his promise to God the Father before the foundation of the world. Peter and the rest of the disciples, and this is ultimately the reason that Judas betrayed him, they shared a misinterpretation about who the Messiah was going to be in the Old Testament. The Jews in the Old Testament, maybe, if I can get there, there we go. They had the idea that there was going to be 2 Messiahs, not one. One Messiah was going to be Messiah ben Joseph. Ben is the word for son. So Messiah, son of Joseph, who is the suffering servant. And that's where you get Isaiah 53. But then they also had the idea of Messiah ben David, the Messiah, the son of David, who was going to be the ruling king. They couldn't see the two as one. They only saw them as 2 separate people. And the disciples believed that, and Peter did as well. Peter was trying really hard, but he missed it. Can you relate? You do something that's really great. God uses you in a fantastic way, and you're so happy. And then you turn around a day later or so, and you just make a fool of yourself. You act so dumb. You let yourself down. You let God down, you feel. We're so much like Peter, or at least I am. Sunday, I was so frustrated with myself because on Easter, of all the days you want to be perfect as a pastor, you want it to be on Easter. You know, you just, if you're going to be perfect, that's the day you want to do. And I've had some sermons that I thought, man, I've preached my heart out, and I thought I did exactly what God wanted me to do. And by the end of the sermon on Sunday, I felt like I had just failed, bombed. It was terrible. I was upset with the world and myself more than anything else. I relate very well to Peter. But just because I do doesn't mean God doesn't want to use me or use you. God understands who we are. He understands that we're human and that we don't always get it right. And he wants to use people just like you and me and Peter to be a part of his victorious church. You don't have to be perfect or get the perfect results, because it's in Jesus, it's in our weakness that Jesus is found strong. And this is what, oh man, this blessed me so much. So, verse 33, go back one, Daniel. Verse 33, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," talking to Peter. Then look at verse 34. This is so cool. Then Jesus called the crowd to himself along with his disciples, and he told them. So he literally, as they're walking, he turns around and he looks at his disciples and Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And then he goes along the side of the road and he gathers everybody together, including Peter. And he says, "If anyone wants to follow me," they're on their way to Jerusalem, "he must deny himself, pick up his cross, and follow me continuously. Because whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and for the gospel will save it. What profit will a person have if he gains the whole world and forfeits his life? Indeed, what can a person give in exchange for his life or his soul?" From the New King James. "If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes with his holy angels in his Father's glory." He gets done getting after Peter, and then he turns around and gives Peter and the disciples and everyone following him an invitation. He knows that Peter's weak. He knows that we're weak. And even with that, he's okay. He knows we don't have it all, because he's going to give it to us. He knows we don't know it all. That's okay, because he's going to implant it in us. He knows that we're fearful. That's okay. Like Moses, he's going to go with us. He knows we're human. And in the very moment when Peter is absolutely trashed, he thinks he's doing great, and then he's humiliated, he's frustrated, Jesus says, "No, come on, you can still follow me." Thankfully, he does it again on the beach after his resurrection, but that's way down the road. There's absolutely nothing in this world that compares with walking with God and surrendering your life to him at any age. There's been some wonderful men that they've got saved and they'd run from a call of God for a long time. And then God uses them in fantastic ways, even after coming back at an old age. We are to live our lives as Christ did. First and foremost, Christ was God's servant. That's what Mark, that's this entire book, that's his focus, is that Jesus was the suffering servant. Jesus came to serve God first and foremost, and then second, his fellow man. And Jesus says, if you're coming with me, you have to follow as I did. Serve God first and foremost, and then anyone that's around you, you serve them as well. Anything less, don't even worry about picking up the cross. It's a harsh reality. But there's nothing that compares to it. At the end, or before this, and then these two questions, Jesus asks some very challenging questions. And I'd like to go over them just really quickly as we close tonight. When we go to the doctor to get a checkup, they always pull out the stethoscope, they always pull out the blood pressure cuff, and then they start asking you a bunch of questions. Well, have you had this lately? Or have you felt this? Or they go down a whole list of things. Well, it's not because there's anything major going wrong. Because if there was something major going wrong, you'd have been in there before a checkup. They'd be asking you all of those questions about the major things. No, they're asking you minor things, because if you answer yes to any of them, well, there may be a problem. There may be something we need to take care of. And when you do answer yes, and they say, well, all right, we may have to run some tests here. All right, doc, what do we got to do? We got to stop this thing before it changes and makes us sick, or Worse, it becomes uncontrollable, right? That's the reason we go in for checkups. Similarly, these questions that Jesus is about to ask us, or we ask for ourselves, if we answer yes to these, doesn't mean we're lost. Could mean we're lost. But maybe there's a problem that we haven't been seeing that we need the doctor to take care of. So here's the questions that Jesus asked. Have you been putting on a spiritual show? Have you been acting? One person on the outside, but on the inside you're different? Do you look down on others or are not compassionate to others who you see is not as strong in the faith? You see some people that are pretty messed up. Well, thank the Lord I'm not like them. Are you killing me?
Just cut off.
Are you focused on a politician to save our nation? I'll tell you what. There isn't any one of those people in Washington or Louisville or Frankfurt, that can save our problems. What our nation needs is Jesus. Amen? Anything less than that, it's not going to save our nation. Are there better ideologies than some? Absolutely. Are there better candidates than some? Absolutely. But what we need is not a political solution. We need Jesus. If we had Jesus, we don't need the government's control anymore. Right? There's not a politician that can save our nation. But there is a king. And his name is Jesus. Are you living a life filled with doing things that you know God doesn't want you to do? This is the same way the Herodians lived. They were proud of their sin. Or at least if they weren't, they'd hide it and they'd continue to do it. If you keep living with sin in your life and you don't change, I got news for you. You're not a Christian. Plain and simple. You need God to break Satan's chains of sin that hold you down. Now, I'm going to say this, but I also want to make a clarification because I know it happens to a lot of people. There is a difference between temptation and sin. Temptation is the work of evil. Sin is what you do with the temptation, and that's on you. That's not the work of evil. That's your work. There's a whole lot of people that haven't done any sin, but Satan comes along with the temptation, and then because they've been tempted, Satan comes across and beats them over the head and says, oh, you've done it. No, it was the work of evil. But if you stopped it at the door and you didn't sin, you haven't sinned. And there's clarification that needs to be there. Next question. Do your hearts not recognize the spiritual truth? Or are you simply taking someone else's word for it? In other words, when you study the Bible or you do a Bible study when you're hearing a sermon, are you just taking whoever's delivering it for their word? Or is God, when you reading his word, giving you revelation? Is your heart hard or calloused? Do you have trouble believing what God can do? Do you have trouble being compassionate to the hurting? Do you have trouble feeling anything? These could be a warning sign that there's problems. Do you have eyes but fail to see what God is doing? Do you have ears but fail to hear what God is capable of doing? Do you not remember what God has already done? And then his last two questions were, who does everyone around you say that I am? And then the most important question, who do you say that I am? If you've answered yes to these questions, it doesn't mean you're necessarily lost, but it does mean there's probably a problem there that you need the great physician to take care of. If you've answered yes, there's only one person that can help. And it's not a politician, it's not your teacher, it's not your preacher. It's the only one that can. It's the Messiah, Jesus. He says, if you come to me, I will by no means cast you out. He wants to free you He's paid a high price that you could be free. If there's a need, today's the day to take care of it. Let's pray together.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I pray this video was a blessing to you. If it was, please hit the like button. This helps other people find our content as well. You can also subscribe to the channel by clicking on my beautiful face. This will give you announcements when we put out new videos. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists of our verse-by-verse Bible studies, and then you'll also see the newest video that we've put out. We try to put out 2 or 3 a week. I pray that God richly blesses you. Thank you for watching.